Stop Now, a social experiment enterprise.
Welcome to Stop Now. I'm Nate.
Hello, everyone. We are back again.
Wait a minute. You don't sound like Melissa. JK, it's been so long. How are you?
Yeah, Nate. Melissa backed out. She has some work. I'm good. How are you?
I am good. It's been an interesting year so far here in 2021, but Stop Now has just been rolling on. We've been doing so good this year, and I'm excited for the show this week, JK.
Yeah, Nate. Can you believe we have been doing it live? You both have been doing it for more than 12 weeks now. And we got a lot of people watching and giving positive feedback.
It doesn't seem like it's been 12 weeks, 3 months that we've been doing Stop Now live for the people. It feels like only yesterday when we turned on these cameras, JK and Melissa and I sat down with our first guest. And so like, I don't know, JK, you got me feeling kind of nostalgic. Do you want to have a retro show today?
You mean look back at 2020 episodes, like best moments of our talk show? Is that what you're referring?
I think that might be what I'm thinking about, JK, because, again, like 2020 was a year that a lot of us had never experienced things that we went through last year. And so I think it'd be great to go back and look at some of our favorite moments from the show and share it with the viewers.
Surprise. Not really, just putting it all together to play it out later. But then anyway, since you asked, I thought let's do it before our special guest join us today.
That's great. That is excellent.
Visa ban. Today we are going to discuss the ongoing unrest over the H-1B visa.
Now let us highlight some news stories related to this issue. 1. Trump suspends H-1B and other work visas through December 2020.
All right, so on today's episode, we bring you the issue of racism in America, visa ban, and the continuation of the ongoing story of the H-1B visa from the last episode.
Oh, I see. So this is getting serious, or are you just trying to be funny here, Gary?
No, Nate.
Yes, Nate, but that's not the point. Many people trafficking workers onto the Thai fishing boats are not being prosecuted. And there are cases of slavery happening in our own country that the justice system are still doing nothing about.
According to the Trump administration, the entry of additional workers through the H-1B visa programs presents a significant threat to employment opportunities for Americans affected by the extraordinary economic disruption.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So H-1B visa is an employer-employee visa. Just to give you some context, we're looking at, H-1B visas should be eliminated, okay? Mm-hmm. And there were clear labor violations. And I'm an immigration attorney. I can speak to the immigration violations, but a labor attorney would jump all over this and talk about all the labor law violations that happened.
Yes, Melissa, and this is not just any talk show. This is a very special talk show because we're going to end the talk show, and this is going to be our last show, guys.
Sorry, Nate. What's going on? Are you trying to be funny and make a joke?
No, Melissa, I'm serious.
This is not Nate. Who is this?
Can you guess?
Only challenged all the attorneys in my public meetings in YouTube that I would like to debate with any attorney, immigration attorney, who can prove me wrong.
And then it's, you can't just think about yourself. There's people who are carrying the virus and they have no symptoms.
That's awesome because I think family because of everything that's going on with COVID. So that's awesome.
logic, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, like I would have even
Exactly right. So maybe they would have even filed the H-1B, isn't it? You have to pay.
Subscribe to the channel, and if you have questions, if you have stories, if you need answers, reach out to the team and JK. Social distance, wash your hands, and we'll see you next year. Bye, Melissa. All right, so like we were talking about earlier, JK, you know, one of the best things about this show is that we have the opportunity to talk to a lot of different people, a lot of different folks with different backgrounds and levels of expertise. And so it is my pleasure, and your pleasure too, my friend, to welcome to the show this week Rosie Martinez. And Rosie is the owner of the Regional Justice Center, the consulting services. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to bring on Rosie Martinez. Rosie, how are you doing this week?
For having me on today. I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Good. We're doing good.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be on your platform today.
Thank you for your time. Look, we made it through 2020, so that's a blessing in and of itself. So we're doing all right this week.
Yes.
So one of the things that we always like to talk about, Rosie, is just, you know, how our guests kind of got into their field in terms of advocacy and you know, trying to promote social change and goodwill in this country. And so, you know, how did you get started? Can you give the viewers a little bit of information about your background?
Well, I have 20 years in victim services. I worked previously in community-based programs and system-based programs as well. And I dedicated my entire 20 years of a career in victim services to help or specialize in helping victims of human trafficking and also victims of domestic violence. So those are some of the expertise that I've been able to gain through my work. I started my career very young in working in the juvenile probation department. And that's where I found the passion to work in this type of field, because the majority of the kids that I was working with came from backgrounds of being in abusive homes, witnessing domestic violence, and many of them were being sexually exploited when they were running away from home. And 20 years ago, human trafficking was not a hot topic. You know, people were not identifying what sexual exploitation of children was or what trafficking was. And so I dealt with a lot of those kids that were runaways that were exchanging food, shelter, and other goods as a form of survival, which is now recognized as survival sex, and it's also recognized as a form of sexual exploitation of children. So that's where I started, you know, trying to get more information and knowledge and expertise of what to do with these kids. How could I, in the setting that I was, help them? Because once I had them, they were already in the criminal justice system. Everybody had already felt them. They had been through so many different systems before, and nobody had identified, you know, what was actually causing them to run away from home. And it's funny, Nate, because the term itself, runaway, it clearly says they're running away from something.
Right.
But the majority of the times we classify runaways as trouble kids, as, you know, kids that, you know, are constantly getting into trouble with the law or in school, but they really never identify what is the cause of them running away from home. And so that's how I started my career. I started to look for classes and anything that could help me so that I could develop victim-informed trauma care to assist those kids and see them as victims, not as criminals. And that's how I started my career in victim services. From there, I went on to working for the local domestic violence shelter.
Well, really quick, Rosie, because I think that a lot of our listeners out there might need a little bit of background first in terms of the definitions. And so like when we're talking about human trafficking, like how would you define that and then go on and, you know, speak about, you know, how you have decided to help these victims and these survivors?
So human trafficking in Texas is the legal definition of it is the exploitation through sexual or labor purposes of a person, of a human being. Basically, the selling or exploitation of a human being for the purposes of gaining some type. It doesn't have to be monetary. It can be gaining other means of goods or financial from the exploitation of that person. So it's defined as using fraud, force, or coercion. When we're going through the legal definition, we have to make sure that those elements apply for it to be considered human trafficking. And Texas is one of the few states that prosecutes trafficking at the state level as well. So traditionally, human trafficking is prosecuted in the federal system, but Texas has enacted laws that are state laws that we are able to prosecute somebody under the state legislation and also in the federal. In my previous job, I worked for a prosecutor's office, and it was very common for us to have cases where we were prosecuting the state statute and the feds were prosecuting the federal for the same defendant. So somebody can be charged in both systems for committing human trafficking in Texas.
So I guess real quick on that point, like, and again, like I think I'm like a lot of the viewers out there that, like, you know, you mentioned Texas is one of the few states where they can be charged on a state level. Like, why isn't that something that's national? Like, why isn't that a crime in every state that somebody can be charged for?
I think that it has always been treated as a federal offense, and most recently, a lot of states have enacted laws, state laws, to be able to prosecute human trafficking, because in the federal system, they have to look for a lot of threshold to be able to charge somebody in federal law. So we're able to charge other crimes. Like, for instance, if you have a human smuggling case, I come from a border community. Okay, the county where I'm at is border to Mexico. We deal a lot with smuggling and trafficking, and a lot of the times those cases intersect. And we'll talk about the differences so that the viewers understand what the differences between both of them are. But you can have a smuggling case turn trafficking right away. And so in a smuggling case turn trafficking, when somebody gets arrested for smuggling a person, even if it's a willful person that paid to be smuggled into our country, and then they keep that person to exploit him, whether it's for labor or sexual exploitation or for forced labor or debt bondage. And debt bondage means I paid you X amount of money to cross me, but now that I'm in the US, you're going to extort me for more money. Then that turns into a trafficking situation, because now you're keeping the person under debt bondage. And so when we have those type of cases, it's common that we find victims have been assaulted, whether physically or sexually, to be able to keep them in those type of unlawful restraint conditions. So that's a state crime. We can charge the person for assault, for sexual assault, for unlawful restraint, for extortion, for false imprisonment, anything that comes under the state statute. And then the federals will pick up the case as a trafficking case. Okay. So that's how both cases intersect. A lot of the times the feds will say, we don't want to take the case, because they normally want to take big cases where there's a lot of victims. So then the state will pick up, if it's one or two victims, and we'll charge the trafficking part as well.
Oh,
yeah,
you mentioned.
Nate,
Go ahead, JK.
Sorry, I want to help you out on this. So since this month being a National Human Trafficking Awareness Month, Rosie, you mentioned that like the different types of trafficking, and also it impacts the border communities more, right? And normally, for layman terms, many people who are not affected by these kind of activities, they associate like smuggling and trafficking are kind of same one, right? So human trafficking in the sense like people are smuggled into the country in an illegal way. how do you differentiate, and what is the message like you want to bring in, saying that like people who are here are also victims of human trafficking, or who come through legal means also get trapped into this? Do you find a difference in that?
The difference between smuggling and trafficking is human smuggling is the transportation of a person to cross international lines. So just you being crossed over or smuggled to another country is not trafficking. Trafficking is the harboring or the recruitment and transportation of human beings for the purposes of exploiting them through labor and sex trafficking. And a person does not have to be undocumented to be a trafficking victim. We have a lot of U.S. citizens that are being trafficked in our nation. We do have international victims of trafficking that are coming from other countries, but nationality or immigration status has nothing to do with you being a victim of human trafficking. Of course, traffickers do prey on those type of populations. They prey on undocumented persons. They prey on runaways. They prey on people that have issues with drug addiction or that are homeless or vulnerable. They've been through abuse or emotional trauma. So those are some of the tactics that traffickers will use to lure in their victims. But we can also talk about human trafficking. The major difference is that a human trafficking victim can be trafficked in their own home. You don't need transportation to be a human trafficking victim. We have a lot of children that are trafficked in their own home. And so a lot of people associate the smuggling with the trafficking, but smuggling is only transportation of persons. When trafficking, you don't need that transportation element. Somebody can be trafficked in their own home without ever leaving.
So in that case, do you relate this in terms of modern slavery, right? So
Yes.
how does that translate? Like slave trade was prominent, and for some reason we have been in this, whether we like it or not, for a long time. And how does that relates to the trafficking victims?
Right. There's been a huge movement now to call trafficking as modern day slavery, because in reality, that's what it is. It's modern day slavery, whether it's done by force or by coercion or by fraud. And when we talk about by fraud, it's those people that are trafficked when they're promised a job that is not the job that they're coming to do, whether they're either an international victim or a domestic trafficking victims. We have a lot of people that get hired legally to work in different settings, but once they get to that job, then it turns into something else and they're being trafficked. So again, the immigration status does not have anything to do with that. And so a lot of the people that work in this movement have been working towards calling it what it is, which is modern day slavery. And it's a slavery of human beings being trapped through those forms, a lot of times through violence, through the use of violence or threats, to keep in a situation where they can't leave. And they're not being physically restrained. They don't have any chains. They're not being tied, but they're being kept there through means of other forms of threat.
And what kind of, I guess, Rosie, like what kind of assistance or aid or protection like is available for somebody that has been a victim of this or been a survivor of this?
So there's a lot of laws through the state and also federal. In particular, here in the state of Texas, every person that suffers a crime in the state of Texas has constitutional rights. I don't know if you guys remember in our classes in history and social studies, we talked about the Constitution. Well, a lot of us didn't pay attention to it, but under the Constitution, the Bill of Rights has Section 30, which is victims' rights, the crime victims' rights of a person. And it can be any other type of crime, but human trafficking is all added on there. So as a victim of human trafficking, you have rights that have been enacted under our state constitution to protect you. here in the state of Texas, we have what's called the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. And this is a fund that's generated by people that commit crime in Texas, not taxpayers' money. Whenever we talk about that, they always ask us that. These are fines that are collected from people that are actually committing crime, and that goes back into the state for this Crime Victims Compensation Fund. And through this crime, when we're working with trafficking victims, they have the right to apply for that with disregard to their immigration status. They don't need a social security number to apply for it. And they're entitled to relocation expenses. The state can pay up to $2,800 for them to move to another location where they're going to be safe. They're also entitled to receive counseling services, medical services, anything that any injury that was a result of the trafficking can be treated. And it also pays for lost wages. You know, if they had any type of wage theft or they lost wages because of the crime, they can also apply for that. It has other benefits included on there, and the only requirement that the state has is for the victim to press charges, and they would become eligible for that Crime Victims Compensation Fund.
Oh.
That's on the state side. And then on the federal side, they're protected under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that's the legislative congressional act that was passed in 2000. So that act has numerous services and benefits, resources that a trafficking victim can apply for under the federal statute.
So on the immigration side of it, Rosie, you mentioned on the relief, and some of the attorneys also mentioned to us, so there are victim visas like T visas and U visa. But
yes,
in reality, how hard is it to for the because they are already traumatized and being a victim? How do they get that kind of justice? Like what is the logic in who applies for it and how do they get it? Because the attorneys mentioned that it also has some charges. Any lawyers, if you go for their services, they're going to charge more. So
well, actually, there's a lot of agencies that are helping trafficking victims apply for immigration resources. Here in the state of Texas, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid has a trafficking program that assists victims of trafficking with their immigration paperwork, and they don't charge. So there's a lot of nonprofits that are working in this field, especially in the immigration relief field for trafficking victims. But a trafficking victim is eligible to apply for a T visa, and the T visa essentially what it does, it'll give that undocumented victim the right to stay here legally in the United States while we prosecute the case or investigate the case. The only caveat about the T visa is that they're required to continue to provide ongoing cooperation with the investigation or prosecution of the case. So they'll be granted the status, they'll be granted an immigration status, but they have to cooperate with the investigation or prosecution of the state. The only exception to that, if it's a minor victim. If it's a minor victim, they don't have to cooperate. That's not requested under the statute. They can apply for the T visa without meeting that element of cooperation. And that's an immigration status adjustment. It'll give that victim an immigration status. But there's other things that can be done. When there's a trafficking victim, we normally work with the federal side to get what's called continuous presence. And continuous presence is a temporary permit that's granted by Homeland Security to keep the victim here as a witness or as a victim so that we can prosecute that case. And that continuous presence can be extended anywhere from 1 to 2 years or months, however long it takes for us to prosecute that case. So what we normally do when we're prosecuting those type of cases is we ask for the continuous presence and apply for the T visa at the same time, so that by the time we're done, that victim has immigration status through the T visa and they can remain here lawfully with continuous presence.
I guess one question that popped into my mind, Rosie, when you were talking is, you know, when you mention immigration and you know, you talk about being in the border city, I'm wondering, thinking back to last year, did the pandemic have any effect on, human trafficking and this modern day slavery? Did you find any kind of correlation between what the country was kind of going through as a whole and then how that affected human trafficking?
The biggest concern we had with the pandemic and victims of trafficking and domestic violence was that victims were trapped in their homes because of shelter-in-place orders and because of executive orders that were being passed by federal and state and even local governments. And there was an inability for them to contact advocates or law enforcement for help. So that didn't mean that the trafficking had stopped. It just meant that a lot of victims could not call for help because they were trapped essentially with their abuser 24/7 because of the shelter-in-place orders. So that's what we saw that affected COVID. COVID affected in that field of us trying to reach victims. There wasn't any increase that we saw or decrease. It remained the same. The only thing that changed was that there was less reports by victims looking for help. And that was a significant change. And like I said, it affected not just human trafficking, it also affected domestic violence victims. So and then to top it off, a lot of the nonprofits that provide the direct care for those victims were also forced to shut down because of the pandemic. And so resources were very limited for victims during that time.
I guess language is something that I think is very important, Rosie. Like it's, doing this talk show. That's how we communicate with the audience and discuss these topics and try to find a solution, or at least a path to a solution. When it comes to human trafficking, do you feel like maybe there's a language issue in terms of getting more people to become aware of how real this problem actually is?
Right, and I commend you for bringing this topic to mass media communication, because you guys have the ability to expand this message tremendously. But yes, language is very important when we talk about trafficking. And just to explain to you what I mean by that is that in the past, I've always seen terms used to describe trafficking, such as child prostitutes. And there is no such thing as a child prostitute. A child cannot legally consent to sell their body. They can't even legally consent to have sex with anybody, period, much less sell their body for sex as an adult. And we're talking about any age of child, because we have dealt with, babies all the way to 17-year-olds that are being sexually exploited. So we cannot use that term. We cannot refer to child victims of sexual exploitation or trafficking as child prostitutes. And so every time I see the news putting out an article about something like that, I always write to the editor and explain to them why language matters. The other thing that I see very commonly used is, how do we refer to the buyers? When somebody is buying a child or an adult for sexual exploitation, we call them what? Johns?
Yep.
And so what does that do? That minimizes what they're doing. But on the other side, when we have a person arrested for child sexual abuse, we call them rapists, we call them pedophiles, we call them child, exploiters, whatever. Like we really have to change that term, because the John is also doing the same thing. And we need to stop minimizing that. Being a buyer of sex, whether it's forced prostitution, compelling prostitution, or actually buying a child for sexual purposes, then you should be called a predator, a rapist, somebody that's sexually exploiting children. So on that term as well, like, we cannot continue to minimize what's happening. We have to call it what it is.
Rosie, on that note, language in the terms, like, my understanding is it affecting different cultures or different ethnicity or race? How do you think? Like, because in terms of sexual exploitation, we see a parallel across the board, like all the communities are being impacted.
Yes, this does not discriminate against your ethnic background, your gender. Female and males get exploited equally. So it affects the entire community as a whole. It doesn't, of course, there's some minority groups that get impacted more, but for other reasons, not because of their ethnic group, but because they live in poverty areas, because they're more prone to having other issues like family violence or drug addiction, things like that, that will affect them being trafficked more often. But it has nothing to do with your ethnicity. Like I've seen victims from all types of ethnic groups, plus other countries. However, I can say that here in the state of Texas, there's a lot of domestic trafficking of minors that has been documented. So that's one of the biggest group that we see is our foster kids and our runaways that are U.S. citizens that are being exploited for sexual exploitation.
I guess like if you could say one thing, Rosie, if we have a viewer out there that might be kind of stuck in a situation like that and looking for answers, looking for help, looking for a solution, what would you say to them?
I would say that they need to call to get help, even if they just call to talk to someone. There's a lot of advocates, there's a lot of hotlines nationally and statewide that answer calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's shelters available where they can go and seek safety. There's even runaway drop-in centers that have been established across our state so that a runaway can drop in at any time of the day, and they're actually screening now for trafficking of minors in those centers. So the best thing that somebody can do, or if you know someone that is being exploited, a runaway, a foster child that's being exploited, or somebody that's being exploited for labor. We have a lot of labor trafficking that happens also. Just give them that information. Resource information is super important. Get them the help that they need. The help is there through state and federal legislative acts that have been passed. And it doesn't matter what immigration status they have. It doesn't matter what ethnic group. They will get the same assistance if they call for help.
Oh, we thank you for that, Rosie. And I just want to say, it's been this whole month because we've talked to a lot of great guests about this subject, and it's something that I personally was not I was aware of trafficking, but I didn't know how serious it was and how deep it was and how it, like you said, it doesn't matter race, where you're from, your immigration status, it affects all these communities. And so we definitely appreciate you for spending some time with us this week. If somebody wanted to get in contact with you and learn more about this issue and how they can help, how would they be able to do that?
They can reach out to me. I have a Facebook page for the Regional Justice Center, and they can send me a message there. I post a lot of the things that are happening nationally and statewide when it comes to trafficking on there to do prevention education. The other thing that I do want to mention is that there's also the victim can seek a protective order against their trafficker, and human trafficking protective orders are lifetime orders. So the victim will get a lifetime order against their trafficker, a protective order, and the protective order protects the person, not the address. So it doesn't matter where the victim moves. If they move to another place in another area in the nation, their protective order will go with them, and they're going to have it for life. And then now, most recently, the state enacted civil statutes for trafficking victims. So now they're able to sue civilly their traffickers. So we have a lot of legislation right now, a lot of lawsuits pending, civil actions, lawsuits against hotel industries, against the legitimate business centers of massage parlors, and all those legitimate businesses that have been exploiting victims. So now the victims have the right to sue them civilly for monetary compensation. And so we're keeping track of that to see how that goes. I think the most prominent case that people have seen lately is the Epstein case, and that has a major civil lawsuit in that case, and there's a lot of victims that entered in that suit. So now victims can sue civilly as well. They sue their trafficker for monetary relief so that they can get back all the money that was taken away from them during the exploitation.
Thank you for that last bit of information, because I do feel like there's a lot of people that want to help and want to find out more about this, or survivors and victims out there that want to get free from this, but they just don't know. They don't have the information, and you don't know what you don't know. And so I feel like knowledge is something that can help, kind of break these chains, Rosie.
Yes, yes. And like I said, I commend you guys for doing this, because it does make a huge difference when you provide that knowledge to people so that they know what rights protect them. They know that there's laws that are going to be used against traffickers, because the intention is to stop the trafficking, not just to rescue the victim, but we need to prosecute the people that are doing this crime, this what we call modern day slavery, that somebody needs to be held accountable for that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Rosie, and we appreciate your time. And for the audience out there, again, like, this has been a really good month of learning about this issue and learning about how we can tackle it. So again, we want to thank Rosie Martinez, the owner of the Regional Justice Center Consulting Service. Thank you so much, Rosie.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Yes.
Once again, thank you, Rosie.
And I'll send you the I don't know if you have the number to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That's usually the number where victims can call to request for help, and it's done confidential. They don't have to call law enforcement. They just call for information, and they're able to talk to an advocate.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Stop Now, a social experiment enterprise. Stop, listen, share. Everyone can make a difference. We are on a mission. Everyone should do something greater in their lifetime. Change the future. Be a proud member. Join us to support, volunteer, and donate.